So, out of the blue a couple of weeks ago, I get this email asking me if I wanted to review a case. This blew me away because it's only been a few videos since I came back to YouTube, and I honestly wasn't expecting anyone to ask me to review anything for a considerable amount of time into the future, if at all. And while I was pretty excited about the opportunity, I was also apprehensive. I made it clear that I won't review anything unless I can give my honest opinions on the product, or reveal what my testing leads me to, good or bad. And that goes for anything I'll ever review on this channel. If me getting a product for review is contingent on me giving it a good review, then I simply won't accept it for review. That being said, they agreed, and this showed up in the mail. This is the Gamdias Talos M1, which is a mid-ATX tower case, and it currently sells for $90 USD on Amazon. And before I get into the review, I realized that if I want to be taken seriously as a case reviewer on YouTube, I have to put a plant on the top of this thing and give it a name. So this is Dave. Dave is a bit big and overweight, but he illustrates the first thing that I noticed when I took this out of the box. And that's the fact that this is sturdier than I was expecting it to be. Anyways, let's take a look at the Talos M1's features. Starting at the front down at the bottom is the front header panel, which has your power button, a button for fan speed, and one for lighting effects. The power and hard drive LEDs, headphone and mic jacks, as well as two USB 2 and two USB 3 ports. Moving up the full length of the front panel on either side are two RGB light strips, which can be synced with the front fans via the included RGB fan hub. But the most striking thing about the front of this case is the center tempered glass panel. It has a dark tint and looks great. I was worried it was going to be completely closed off when I first looked at pictures, but I was happy to see that there are gaps on the sides that widen as you move down the panel to give it some airflow. Whether or not that causes restriction airflow, we'll have to see. Heading to the top, we can see the Gamdias logo, which is backlit. Also, you can swap the logo and the header panel in case you want your USB ports at the top. Moving over to the side, the dark tempered glass continues with a full glass side panel. It's really clean with no thumb screws holding it on. Instead, they opted for magnets at the front, which hold it relatively solid to the frame. To open the side, they give you a lip at the bottom of the panel to grip. The hinges at the back are nice and smooth without really any play. To remove the glass panel, you just have to lift it off the hinges. The first thing that I noticed when I took off the glass was that there are a lot of cable pass-throughs, and they're in all the right places. The motherboard tray has support for up to a full ATX motherboard. At the front, you have a panel which the manual doesn't really specify what you're meant to put here, but these holes line up perfectly with the bottom screws of a 2.5-inch drive, and the pass-throughs in the middle are perfect for routing the cables. And as you can see, two SSDs really do clean up how this panel looks. Now let's talk about fan and radiator support. At the front, you can install up to 3 120mm or 240mm fans. According to the manual, you have support for either a 360 or 280mm radiator. Now, I'm not sure if it was a typo that they didn't include it, but I see no logical reason a 240mm rad wouldn't fit. Moving down to the PSU shroud, there's a generous opening down here for the radiator. Enough that you should be able to fit a 60mm thick rad or a 30mm in push-pull. Lastly, I want to note that there's no filter at the front, so if you live in a dusty environment or have pets, be prepared to clean out your system more often. However, there's a mesh right behind the fans that I'm not sure why it's there. I don't know if they meant that as some sort of filtration, but the openings are far too big for it to be an effective filter, and I really only see it serving as an airflow restriction. Moving up to the top, we have a standard magnetic filter in case you're using it as an intake. You can install either two 120mm or 240mm fans up here. It also supports either a 240 or 280mm rad. And at the back, you can install a 120 or 140mm fan, but the manual says it only supports a 120mm rad. At the back of the case, we can see that we have 7 expansion slots as well as a vertical GPU mount. There's no riser cable included, and I wouldn't expect one at this price. However, I should mention that vertical GPU mounts this close to the side panel aren't the best idea for air-cooled GPUs. At the bottom, you have mounting for a standard ATX power supply, which can be mounted facing up or down since the PSU shroud has ventilation at the top. At the bottom, there's an easily removable filter for cleaning. To take off the backside panel, you just have two non-captive thumb screws and it just slides off like you'd expect. There's a good sized opening back here in case you need to access the back of the CPU socket. And there are a lot of zip tie points for cable management. But most of your cables are going to have to be run up front here, as there's not a lot of room between the motherboard tray and the side panel. Down below you have a hard drive cage, which come out either two 3.5-inch hard drives or two 2.5-inch SSDs. The case is only 15 3/4 inches deep, so using a larger power supply would be a very tight fit, as would using a slave cable set or extensions. The drive cage can be moved forward, but will limit how thick the front radiator can be. However, the hard drive cage can be completely removed. The last thing to talk about is the RGB fan hub. This supports up to 8 fans, so 6 in addition to the 2 that come with the case. The fan speed button at the front allows you to run the fans at high or low setting, or you can just turn them off. The lighting effects cycle between a strobing RGB cycle, breathing RGB cycle, color shift, and your typical solid colors. Keep in mind that these RGB LEDs are not addressable and cannot be synced with your motherboard. Well, that's it for the overview. Now we just need to toss some parts in here and test it out, so cue the B-roll. Alright, now that I've had a chance to build in this, I can do some testing to see how much of a restriction to airflow this front panel actually is. And I really did want to be able to test this using noise normalized testing at 40 dB, but I just don't have the specialized equipment that I'd need to adjust the voltage of these fans since they're proprietary. So I just had to set them to their max, and then we can just look at the difference in temps. All CPU testing was done with IDA64 stress test for 15 minutes, and on the GPU I used Furmark. And I had an ambient degree of 20 degrees Celsius, and both the CPU and GPU have a fresh application of MX4. First, I wanted to be able to test it in the stock configuration as it comes out of the box. And as you can see, we have a CPU temp of 64 degrees C and a GPU temp of 72 degrees C. Removing the front panel reveals that we do indeed have an airflow restriction, with the CPU settling down at 60 degrees and the GPU settling down at 65. So I put the front panel back on and added a 140mm fan at the rear, and I ended up with a CPU temp of 58 and a GPU temp of 67. I had suspected that this was going to help quite a bit, and we ended up with a lower CPU temp than we did with the front panel removed. Next up, I needed to see if removing that mesh would improve the airflow to any measurable degree. And I ended up seeing 57 on the CPU and 66 on the GPU. And before I added the rear fan and removed the mesh, I was curious to see if moving the bottom fan to the top would help at all. And I measured a CPU temp of 61 and we got 69 degrees on the GPU. Lastly, I wanted to test what I assumed would be the optimal configuration. Bottom fan moved to the top, rear 140mm fan, and no mesh. And with this we see the best results with the CPU running at 55 degrees and the GPU at 65 degrees. So we can see that there is room for improvement here. With testing out of the way, let's talk about what I like about this case and things that I'd change. And what I really like about this case is the fact that it has a really clean exterior. I like the look of the front glass and the fact that there aren't any thumb screws holding on the side panel. I also like the fact that there are plenty of cable pass-throughs, and last, I thought this case was pretty easy to build in, at least once I removed the hard drive cage. Now, what I would change. And while I like the lighting, the Gamdias logo up top is a solid color, and that color is yellow, which means that you sort of have to go with a yellow theme or something that complements yellow, or it kind of sticks out. Now, you can't turn it off, and I feel like it should have at least been color neutral or been capable of syncing with the rest of the lighting. And even though there are a lot of cable pass-throughs, at this price I really think there should have at least been one on the PCI Express and two on the main cable pass-throughs on the motherboard tray. Next, the expansion slot covers are the breakout style, and there are only 3 of them, so even after installing your GPU, you still have 2 open slots. And that's really more indicative of a sub $40 case, and you really should have at least 5 standard expansion slot covers on this case at this price in my opinion. Now these fans do look good, but this case needs at least one more at the rear, as we saw in my testing. However, you can't buy replacement fans, as Gamdias doesn't make these fans anymore. I spoke with my contact over at Gamdias, and I was told that they have some new fans with a new controller, and these fans are not interchangeable with the new controller. This is really due to the fact that these new fans have addressable RGB and can be synced with ASUS, ASRock, MSI, and Gigabyte motherboards. I just hope that future revisions of this case come with the revised fans. And in my temperature testing, I found that the fan configuration kind of needs to change. Having the fan at the bottom of the front panel is pretty much just for looks. As you can see, not only does it not have good airflow, it's actually sucking that piece of paper up against the mesh. There seems to be some sort of turbulence here, and that's probably because the fan is so close to the glass that it just can't pull in much air anyways, as the front glass is at an angle, so the middle and top fan have more room to breathe. Now, you might be thinking that the easiest and quite obvious solution would be to take that bottom fan and move it to the top like I did. Well, it's not that easy, because the manual says that this case supports 3 120 filmans up front, and you can do that, but you won't be able to get the front panel back on. And that's because this chassis was clearly designed for a different case, and the front panel was created to make a new model. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because companies like Fractal, for instance, do this all the time. The issue here is that there's a piece of plastic on the front panel that blocks the installation of a fan in the top position. Worse yet, there aren't a lot of rails for the mounting of 20mm fans, limiting where they can be mounted on the front panel. So in order to get the fan up top and not be completely jank, I had to remove that mesh That way I could use the top screws and they're kind of just covering the front panel just barely, but they do hold. So what needs to happen here is that the two 120mm fans that come with the case need to be moved to the top of the front panel. The front panel then needs to be notched, so that can be a thing, or in case someone wants to install three 120mm fans without having to move them to the inside of the case. Moving the front glass panel out would also help some. And they could also do without that front mesh and perhaps replace it with some less restrictive pair of cross members for support. And it would be nice if the front panel metal were a little less flimsy. Lastly, this should come with a rear fan. That alone would have a big impact. Taking all this into account, do I recommend running out and buying this case? And in its current state, I have trouble giving it a solid recommendation. But if you find it on sale for like $70, it would totally be worth picking up. I mean, it does come with two RGB fans, and the case looks pretty good. However, since you can't buy more of these fans, and the case really needs one, at least at the rear, I find it hard to count them as a pro. But you can always just add a non-lit color neutral 140mm fan at the back, and it would be perfectly fine. Plus, I feel like there are a few things that need to change for this to be in the same price bracket as something like, say, the Phanteks Enthoo Pro M. With the changes I suggested, and if it came with the new fans and controller, absolutely. But if you're really in love with the looks of this case, just by adding a rear fan helped immensely. And you can always do what I did and remove the front mesh and move the front fans up higher, and that should help as well. And if you wanted to get the Gamdias fans, I would highly suggest the 3 140mm pack for $60, but they also have 4 and 5 packs of the 120mm fans. So the Gamdias Talos M1. It's not a bad case. And there are just a couple of things holding it back from being a relatively strong competitor in its price bracket. Anyhow, as usual, any products or tools used in this video will be down in the description. And if you have any questions or comments, you know what to do. Thanks for checking out this video, and I hope you found it useful. If you did, consider tossing it a like and maybe subscribe to see future videos. I also wanted to thank Gamdias for taking an interest in my small channel. Anyways, guys, take it easy, and I'll see you with the next video.